time is extremely, extremely powerful when it comes to building assets. And the sooner you can get them to start in a serious way. I mean, I really think we should revamp our tax code to incentivize saving at age 25 for the long term. I mean, it's ridiculous the way we think about it. Well, you know, we'll let people save twice as much when they turn 50. That's not enough. Make them save twice as much when they're 25, and they won't have to save twice as much when they're 50. So that's one factor, is that the time is terribly, terribly powerful in this discussion. And this kind of ties into investment returns, which is kind of, we're carrying on from what we would assume those rates of return to be in your own, really your portfolio. And a key factor in determining that, because usually that's one thing that people feel they need help with when it comes to, you know, getting their financial life in order, is making sure they're investing their money prudently, okay? And one of the key decisions you're going to make is whether you're going to follow what I call an evidence-based approach versus an active management approach. And most of the money in this country is managed, probably 80% of it. If we look at the money that's invested in all the different investment vehicles out there, about 80% of it is invested in what's called an active manner, meaning there's a portfolio manager on top who, through smart analysis and investment acumen, is actively deciding when to buy, when to sell, when to be in, when to be out, what to buy, what to sell. And that's active management. You notice I have that paired directly across of a roulette wheel. And I'm not really making a joke out of it, though I am. Versus an evidence-based approach. And this is an actual portfolio risk formula here, where really what the approach here is doing is using what's taught in business school as modern portfolio theory, and where the focus is more on not the selection of the investments, but the structure of the portfolio. And we call this evidence-based because the evidence shows this works. I don't call this evidence-based because the evidence shows it doesn't very well, okay? And what analysis I've done of some of these portfolios, it's really just amazing. So I'm going to give you a primer on this so you get an understanding of it, because it's of huge importance to somebody. I mean, and I think you'll see why. This is a study by Dalbar, and it's mainly focused on investor behavior and equity returns over the last 20 years, and the study was done in 2008. And we've got the S&P 500 index here, roughly returning an average of 6.5% over that time frame. The S&P 500 it's not a fixed index because it does shift so often based on decisions by Standard & Poor's, but it's relatively considered to be the 500 largest companies in the investment universe in the US, right? So what did those companies, what did their stock price return? 6.5%. The average equity investor over this time frame got about a third of that. Well, less than less than a third. 1.87%. Rounded off, call it 1.92. Inflation over that time frame was 2.89. So do they keep up with inflation? No. The average person? Now I know we're all above average, right? But still, at some point you got to consider the fact that maybe if you're above average this year, you might be below average next year, especially when it comes to investing. So the question comes is, well, why? Why wouldn't they at least get what the S&P 500 got? And the key factor here that they've discovered is, well, we sold it, we didn't hold it long enough to get the return that was there for us to take. It's there, it's on the street. All we got to go do is pick it up. But we got to hold it long enough, right? And routinely we throw it down because we think something else is better. And some of that is driven, well, probably a huge piece of it is driven by the marketing machine that comes out of Wall Street. Because if they always have something better to sell you, they continue to make money, right? So this is a real key chart here, because there's some key lessons. You basically have a choice. This was 2008. So basically, the average equity investor did worse in 2008 than the index did as well. So we kind of know that when times get tough, people cash in. And to their own detriment. They don't hold on. So there's a key lesson here. The worst investment you can make is one you can't hold on to. And I'm talking because it gets too hot in the kitchen, you leave. Right? So these are kind of the key differences between active management and evidence-based. Active management is really, at some point, it's gut level. It's intuition and prophecy. I mean, it's driven by a lot of analysis. But at the end of the day, you've got to make a decision based on what you think is going to happen going forward. Humans are terribly bad at predicting the future. It's just not really our bailiwick, right? So we talked about some of these. Depending on picking winners and losers, when to be in or out, typical strategies, track record, investing, stock picking, market timing, and I told you 80%. The evidence-based approach accepts returns are random. They're not predictable. The information today really doesn't tell us anything about what's going to happen tomorrow. And that if we make a prediction based on what we know today as to what's going to happen tomorrow, it's really a guess. And if we're right, it was luck, it really wasn't skill. The evidence-based approach improves the risk-return trade-off through structure of the portfolio and increased diversification. And the focus is on reducing non-compensated risk. So there's different risk factors in a portfolio. Having an active manager, I think you'll see in the next few charts, is one of those that you can control for by not doing it that way. And there's increased focus on reducing costs, fees, and taxes. And that's really where the rubber meets the road. It's not that these active folks aren't smart, but they're also expensive, and there's a drag or a tailwind or a headwind on the portfolio to implement this stuff. And that's where generally they lose out. And we're after all, we're talking about your portfolio, not what they can do before the costs, right? Because you've got to pay the costs. So these are the percentage of active managers in public equity funds that failed to beat their benchmark, relative benchmark, over the 5 years as of December 10th, 2010. So U.S. large cap, 62%. Mid-sized companies, is that a 79? 78%. Small cap, 63%. Global, 60. International, 82. International small, they did better there. Only 24% of them failed to beat the benchmark. And in emerging markets, which generally are considered to be less efficient, 90% of them failed to beat their benchmark. So as an investor, do you want to have the greater probability, 80% of your probability being somewhere in these lines, or somewhere, you know, up here. I mean, that's kind of your choice, because that's where the index was. That's available to go pick up. You got 100% certainty of being at the index if that's what you buy, right? And I've got 80% certainty of not reaching that plateau if I go to active management. So to me, it's kind of a no-brainer. If we switch over to fixed income funds, and these are typically bonds, right, where instead of buying a piece of the company, or, well, you can't buy a piece of the government, I guess, you're lending money, either, you know, to the government and you're getting treasuries in return, or, you know, you're lending money to IBM and getting a bond from IBM in return. You can see the number of failures, these bars are all typically higher. So fixed income is a worse bet in terms of success between this active management versus or evidence-based approach. I mean, when I first started studying this stuff, I thought, yeah, active management, right? I'm smart. And then you realize, you learn enough to realize how much you don't know. And then you start going, oh, I think maybe I'm learned enough to see the whole picture here, not just, because all active managers come out of business schools. And then you'd say, well, I'll hire a really smart manager because, you know, I'm still convinced that I can find the right person. And if I look at who has a really good track record, they should continue to have a good track record, and maybe that's a way to beat the game. Well, to do that, they've got to be able to repeat. And if somebody's really skillful and it's not a random result, right, they should have a good track record and ought to carry forward. Unfortunately, except the information's good to have because it allows you to choose more wisely, bond fund winners don't really repeat. In 2005, 41.3% of bond managers beat their benchmark, right? Right, it's kind of like if we're tracking prices for the consumer price index and milk is in there, we got to know what milk was sold for last month before we know if the price went up this month or relative to a year ago. So it's the same kind of idea. It's an attempt to match oranges with oranges. So we look at this one category, static category of investments, and then we compare what managers working with that same type of investment, how their performance relates back to this static index or benchmark. The idea here is that 41% of them beat their benchmark, right, in 2005, and come 2009, that same group, it was only 0.3. Because they weren't able to repeat that performance going on. So we start with this one pool, right? We've got 43% or 41% of these bond managers in 2005 did better than their index. It would have been better to have been invested with that 41%, right, that year. But you can't invest with them in retrospect. You got to invest with them going forward. So would it have been smart to do that? Well, no, because hardly any of them continued that kind of performance. Almost none. So it's almost like, well, if you pick the winner now, you're more likely to have a loser going forward. Because most of the time these people don't repeat their track records. It's kind of like a stopped clock.